in our house especially, Christmas does not come up or out in any way until we have Remembrance Day on November the 11th. And many of us will pause on November 11th in honor of Remembrance Day. But November the 8th celebrates Indigenous Veterans Day. And it is a day of remembrance for those who have served in missions across Canada, around the world, in times of both war, conflict, and peace. Our Indigenous peoples have proudly served Canada and its operations for well over 200 years. And even today, we have well beyond 2,700 Indigenous members in our military forces. So November the 8th, find time, find somewhere to go. You can do it officially, we can do it all quietly, just to take a moment to recognize, commemorate, and remember their sacrifices, their contributions, and their commitments as well. Those of you who have never joined us before, this is an important moment in our Fridays where we stop and acknowledge that we are coming to you, Sade and Craig and I both, from Calgary, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So today that encompasses our Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. State acknowledges all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So November the 8th, Indigenous Remembrance Day, November the 11th, Remembrance Day. And then after that, Christmas can begin. For those who celebrate Christmas, if not, maybe the holidays, busy time of year.
Excellent. As always, Jenny, so very well done. And thank you for that. Great remembrance. I know I often think of my grandfather at this time of year. He served in World War II. So, but as we kick off here today, folks, really want to thank you all for joining us. A quick ask and just a reminder, if you haven't yet followed us on LinkedIn, please do so. That's where all of our great content and Jenny's thoughts and book recommendations that you would have seen this week come out there. All of the upcoming events will be shared there. And for those of you who don't know, everything that we are doing right now is being recorded live for this to be turned into a podcast version. Should you ever want to walk around, drive around, listen to us at another time other than a Friday morning. So performance management, Jenny. Everything is perfect. Nothing needs to change. Every company and manager does this excellently. No, I think we all know that there's probably room for improvement, room for these conversations to become more meaningful and impactful and helpful to both employee and leader. But why don't we kind of level set here this morning, talking a little bit about, let's just define what traditional performance management is, and then we can springboard from there.
Let's go at its worst. And I truly want to believe this doesn't exist anymore, but I know that it does. It's an annual conversation that looks back on the year that you have had and your performance in the workplace. And from there is a rating or a ranking, and that determines what we'll do with your future. And sometimes it determines whether there's perhaps a bonus in there or a promotion or a thanks very much, you didn't quite make the cut, we'll get rid of you now. That might be at its absolute worst. And there are so many things wrong with that.
Yeah, well, you know, if you go back to the old Jack Welch days of performance management and just chopping the bottom 10% every year, I think certainly you could look at it as traditionally, or not traditionally, has been used in that way. But I think, you know, where I agree, like there's a reason we're having this conversation, is that we believe it can be done better and can be more meaningful. And where I think it absolutely falls down, fails, is if this is a once a year conversation, right? If it's the, here we are, it's that time again. In most organizations, it, depending on how you line it up, it's could either be coming up very shortly or soon after the Christmas break. If you're running on a January to December timeline, but this whole concept of, no, let's sit down once a year and take a look at your entire year and let's go through the company form or the company system and make sure we get your rating in there, and then we're all done.
So let's just get this one blown out the water. I've been married, I need to remember the actual year, but over 25 years, as I think that you have too. You're a good wife as well. And if we tried to run our marriages through a conversation on our anniversary, no. So we make it one step back and we say, okay, we'll do that biannual, whatever the word is. We'll do it twice a year. Still no. And even if you go for, no, it's all good, we'll do it every quarter. No. If you say to me, Jenny, okay, so back in September when this happened, Craig, I don't even remember last week. And like, how do you remember last September to, I keep copious notes. Really? Like, those are copious notes from that person's perspective, and rarely has the other person been involved in the conversation. And then the other part in there that I think gives most of us an allergic reaction, this is a prescribed conversation. And so you have your little checklist in front of you, and I have my little checklist in front of me. And we're coming to it with two completely different ones. It's two different conversations, especially when it's those prescribed ones on the time basis.
Yeah.
And so, excuse me. So as we come into there, you have to justify basically the company's process or the system. And I come to there with my career, with my life in mind. You can't get to really far more separate than that, which, kind of brings us to another part too. What is the purpose of this? And so one of the questions that I would encourage everybody was they start to look at their performance management system is, do your performance reviews actually help get the most out of your people, or actually help your people's performance? And if you can't solidly answer that, yes. And by the way, the Gallup surveys or whoever else we should look at say that only 14% of employees say that they're at all inspired post-performance conversation. Well, we have to do something different, because here's the other part too. Look at the time. Like, if you work in a big organization, take a moment and look at the time that all those managers and all those leaders spend preparing for a conversation they don't like having, they more or less fear. The time having that conversation and the time doing the paperwork. And that's all that time, plus the people that they're talking to. That's time off the job. What's that worth? And is that anywhere near equivalent to what's on the other side of that equation? Like, we've got to be talking millions of dollars in most organizations. And what are you getting back for it?
Very little.
Yeah.
Documentation for a system, documentation perhaps for a tie to merit increases, right? Your rating is tied to your merit increase. No, that I can see generated a reaction.
You're just going to pull my entire soapbox out here, but okay, we'll go there too. Craig, you're a 3.8. Well done. Hey, what? No, you're not 3.8. You're Craig.
Out of what? Sorry.
Yeah, there you go. 10, no, 5.
Oh, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and then we'll tell you that's just fine. Like, literally, we have worked with an organization, and this was pre-pandemic, but they had just redone their entire structure. They still wanted to rate people by a number, which is an insult to most people. And the person that I was talking to looked at me with despair and said, we actually don't want them to reach a 5 because you cannot sustain the 5. You'll burn out. The whole thing, it just doesn't make sense.
No.
And so I think that's our biggest.
Yeah. And then not to belabor the rating part too much, but then the old, I've been in organizations where you've got the forced distribution, right? You're only allowed to have 2 5s on your team.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you really want your entire team to be 5s? Like, you telling me I shouldn't go hire folks who want to deliver at a 5 all the time?
And
go ahead.
But what does that do psychologically too? So you and I have a conversation, you indicate to me in every way possible that I am doing great. And then you go to one of these calibration meetings where we take everybody's awful ratings in the first place anyway, but we're all jostling to see how that can fit on the curve. And you come back and you have to say to me, I got to put you on a 4. that, okay, and then you want me to turn up tomorrow and perform to my best for you. And so there's so many like wrinkles in our systems that really what we're not getting to raising the performance. And I think the essence of it, I was trying to think of how can I succinctly not talk for hours on everything that's wrong? And I think we try and do too much. I mean, I truly don't believe that the money conversation and the performance conversation should be so tightly married together. And everybody gets a little bit excited at that point, yes, but it's the bonus that matters. And that's another thing that happens a lot too. This one's funny because it's just an insult to intelligence, but you set your goals, and if you achieve your goals, I'll give you your bonus. Nobody's stupid out there. What kind of goals are you going to get set? Those goals aren't raising performance. And I have literally had people say to me in a classroom, you asked it, why are you here today? Well, what are you looking for? Well, if I attend today, I get my bonus. Oh, you're welcome. It's not going to help us at all to raise performance. So I think one of the things that we need to look at is how do we narrow the focus to actually achieve what we're looking for? And that is increasing performance.
Exactly. So let's pivot to that a little bit then, right? I think we've kind of defined the fact that the traditional performance appraisal of let's fill out the form, you complete your self-appraisal, I'll complete my appraisal, we'll see where we land up in the middle, figure out how to, come together on the number. Hopefully, if you're in a forced distribution, you're in an organization who at least has the calibration meeting before you have to give your employee the number versus saying, I have to change you because I thought you were a 5, but everybody else thought you were a 4. Let's switch this now to what do we want? Like, really, what's this about, right? If we think about performance management, we can talk about managing performance. That might be a question in and of itself, because you're shifting really from a results appraisal. Let's face it, that's what a performance appraisal in the traditional way is. It's a results appraisal. To your point around how do you manage or how do you help create that environment so your employees can deliver their best? That's what we're talking about here in terms of performance management is how do you help folks do that? And what's the cadence? What's the better way? There was a great comment in the chat here that flowed past is speaking to continuous feedback. And I think there is definitely something in there to lean into.
Yeah. So I think you captured it beautifully in that, first off, let's separate performance and results. And secondly, let's know what performance is. And when I see that, your version of performance will be different to my version of performance. So there's a conversation in itself. And teams need to be having that conversation. Like, what are we doing that equals performance? How are we behaving? And it gets a bit tricky in here because one of the leans that companies went to is, well, we'll just create these competencies and that's how we'll do it. And I'm not against competencies, but I struggle with them being measured, because if you say, Jenny, strategic thinking is a competency, and your version of strategic thinking and my version of strategic thinking, we're down another rabbit hole that isn't helping us raise the performance. So the first conversation has to be around what is performance, and then to this cadence part. That cadence of conversation is crucial. And that is where we start to look at check-in or one-on-ones or whatever we call them. And the research time and time and again comes back to the more frequent, the better. And the dangerous angle that we go down is this feedback angle, because at worst, when I give you feedback, what I'm saying is, I want you to be like me. I want you to do it just like me. And there's that tension immediately it comes up when we were talking about those ratings and rankings. Nobody wants to be like me. They want to be like them. And so I think one of our biggest problems as we hopefully switch towards this cadence of continuous conversation is we're really not very good at delivering useful, constructive conversation that supports performance. And there's two parts to that. There's the, here's what I see, and there's the, can you listen? And there's so many skills involved in both of those.
Yeah. I think the key thing for me, and Tom, you nailed this here in the chat, it's about setting clear expectations and having agreement and alignment on what success looks like. Easy to say, harder to do, definitely. And what I like here, especially that you leaned into, is not only focusing on where people can improve, but on what they're doing right and what we want them to keep doing. I think that piece is so huge. We've talked about Marcus Buckingham's work before, right? Lean into your strengths. Certainly not an excuse to ignore your weaknesses, but how do you minimize and mitigate weaknesses versus trying to improve them? And spending your time focusing on what do you do well and how can you do more of it and how can you leverage it more? But to your point, Jenny, it's how do you have those conversations? I think that become far more important. And, to use a phrase that you would use, we're rubbish at it most of the time, right?
We are rubbish.
Or let's put it this way. There's probably, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure there's lots of folks on the line here who are very good at it. And I think we're probably good at it too, but what gets in the way of it and how can we make it better? Let's maybe look at it that way.
I think if we boil it down simply, I think we overthink it. We constantly overthink it. And so there's two parts to it. So if we're going to do this check-in, if we're going to work continuously, and I love what you just said, it's, what are you working on? How can I help you? And what are you working on? The more that we attach that, the frogs are in full swing today. The more that we attach that to what I get joy from, what I love doing, my strength base, the more engaged I am, the more satisfied I am, the more happy I am to build and learn in that space. Because when we learn from something that we already have those building blocks in place, we already have that mental pathway, it's easy for us to learn and we enjoy it. If you say to me, Jenny, you need to get better at Excel spreadsheets. No, thank you. Like, I haven't got a clue. And I have no motivation. And that's really, really hard. But for somehow, somewhere in the past decade, we completely switched our focus to, well, we've got to look at all these weaknesses and get everybody better in those weaknesses. And we dressed it up nicely. We said they're opportunities, not weaknesses. Right? We're sucking the life out of people where we could be breathing life into that. Now, again, to your point, as you said, we can't ignore them completely, but we can approach it all in a different way. And so that check-in conversation, what are you working on? How can I support you? And then when we have longer, like that conversation doesn't take long. It really doesn't have to take long. Like we think, oh, I have to book an hour. Not really. That could be a 15-minute conversation. It could be a passing conversation if we're face-to-face. It doesn't even have to be 15 minutes. And it could just be like this on a camera too, if you're working hybrid or virtually. I would suggest cameras on for that conversation. And then, later when we've got more time, and maybe that is once a month, we take all of that and the questions become around, what have you enjoyed working on? I like Marcus Buckingham's language. Like, what do you love working on? Because that's an emotional attachment. And if there is nothing in my role that I love, we have a different conversation on our hands.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No. Okay. I was going to say, so when you get into these conversations, I think the key thing in my mind that you would really like to see happen is have them be employee led, right? Versus leader led, if that makes sense. Right. I think that cadence, if you're meeting regularly, whatever it is, depending on the cadence of your business, if it's weekly, if it's every 2 weeks, if it's once a month, You know, if it's once a month, in theory, you're going to have 10 good one-on-one touch points through the year if you're intentional about this. But I think you want to have it driven by the employee versus the leader saying, here's what I see, here's what I see, here's what I see. Right? Can you, is there something in there to dive into?
Yeah. If you're meeting once a month, though, it really can't come from here's what I see, because do you see? Do you even know?
No, it's exactly my point.
What's that? Right? Yeah, what's that proximity within there? So I like that, yes. And we talk a lot about voice share. So voice share is simply how much of the conversation are you taking up? And if your first question is, Jenny, what are you working on? Or Jenny, what are your priorities this week? That's, I don't know how many words, 6, 7 words or whatever. My answer will be far more words, I would think, than that question. So that voice share to me is in the right balance. There's a little bit of you and a lot of your report. And then your second question is either what support do you need? How can I help you? You know, what's in the way? Whatever that second question is, it's going to depend on industry, role, and on all those other things. Yep. Again, there's a few words from you, potentially more from me. And it doesn't just have to be the 2 questions. It can breed from there. And so that voice share is crucial. And I think in an ideal world, I might come and check in with you as your employee. Because in our, sort of legacy thinking, this all sits on the leader's shoulders. Really, in a performance world, I care. I'll come to you for feedback. And I'll say, Craig, what did you think of this? And at that point, I do want you to look back and I do want you to do that. And so I'd really encourage that 2-way part as well.
Yeah. Your comment around once a month, is that frequently enough? It makes me think, just makes me think back to another issue, I think, with performance appraisals is recency bias, right? Yeah. If you're an employee and you know when performance appraisal time is coming up, you can really turn on the charm and turn on the effort in the weeks leading up to the writing of that appraisal. And then probably take your foot off the gas shortly thereafter, because a year from now, your manager is not going to remember that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I think the other piece for me in this, so let's talk about that frequency bit. So if we talk about employee-led and frequency, something that's kind of floating around in my mind is this: we do have some individuals have roles that have very clear objectives that you can look to every week, every couple of weeks, every month, and say, you needed to produce X in this period. You produced X plus or X minus or whatever it might be, versus the how or the progress or the effort or what you're working on. And I'm wondering if there's something in there around this approach of, can you take time to just have a meeting to talk about results? Because let's just focus on results. Whatever your cadence is, get it done, get it out of the way in its own standalone meeting. Separate that from the what are you working on? How are you working on it? How can I coach you on that? I don't know, thoughts. And just if that makes any sense.
It does. It's an interesting one. And it's always interesting. Your background is in sales, and sales is the one place where we still count numbers, and counting is fairly reliable data. And I think, making me think on a Friday morning, I think I'm in favor of separating the 2. And the reason that I'm in favor of separating the 2 is because results are results. You're always going to get results of some kind. I'm wondering if it's an actual valuable use of time, because at the end of the day, the performance leads to the results. So then the 2 kind of intermingle together. And I think the richness of the conversation is the environment set up for the results that you're asking to be reached? And that takes us down a slightly different pathway. But there's a ton of research been done on this. If we set the conditions up for performance, performance will increase. And the conditions for performance won't be strange or unfamiliar to anybody who's on this call. The conditions for performance is, do we have a challenge? Do we have a choice? Is there recognition? Are we paying attention? Do I have the opportunity to grow? I'm missing one as always. Oh, and the purpose that we talked about at the beginning, like what is performance? What's purpose? Why does this team exist? And those conditions, if we've got them right and if we're providing them, actually have been shown to elevate performance as long as leader support is in there. So I still come back to that part is really important to get those results that you're looking for. And the other thing, and I have to say this, Craig, out loud, because it still happens, when we look at results, check before, like just check in with yourself before, before you start that conversation, because what most people still lean towards doing, and we've been taught to do this, here's where we missed the mark. Here's where we didn't get it right. And when we provide that kind of information to our employees, performance goes down. And it doesn't go down just for an hour or two, it goes down for days. So we may not actually be serving, again, we want performance to rise because we're always focused on the rather than the, that's cool, how do we get that? How do we do more of that? So I think there's probably a space for that conversation. But again, what is the intention of the conversation? There's a golden nugget too, isn't it? Always, like, what is the intention of this conversation? Are we helping or are we hindering?
Yeah, that's good. You know, you're giving me something to think about there. And then the whole concept, and I guess where I go on this one is, if, you know, and I appreciate that there are some roles where it is much simpler to measure quantitative output, et cetera, versus others. But even in those roles where you cannot measure quantitative output, you and your team very likely know if you're performing well, performing great, performing poorly, right? You just know. And so in those instances where performance isn't where it needs to be, right? And I don't want to focus on the negative too much, but you know, we were talking about how do we create the conditions for folks to elevate performance, whether performance is poor, great, fantastic, right? Can performance always be better? That's a different conversation. But, you know, where performance isn't going well, and I think that's where most leaders think about in these performance management conversations. What's the best advice you have then for helping to create those conditions for performance to improve without focusing on the button, right?
So
like
first one, yeah. No, this is really good, because people always say, well, so I'm not all right in the fluffy, nice world, but what happens when there's a problem? So the first thing that I would always come to is, you know, why we put these conversations off. And we put them off because they're difficult a lot of the time, or we see them as difficult. And so the first question is, you know, why would you delay supporting your colleague? You know, if we are colleagues and I care about you, why would I delay that conversation? So there's the first part. The worst thing that we can do is not have the conversation. Now, the only time I'm going to go back on what I've said there is if Jenny is typically a really good performer and Jenny's not showing up the way she normally does, is this a pattern, or is this just Jenny's got something going on over there? It's an odd week. You know, there could be something else there. So we're going to bring in that role of empathy. And let's, you know, if classically you're happy and there's one up, okay, well, let's just say, okay, now there's two. There's something that we have to have the conversation early, because the earlier that you have the conversation, we're back to frequency and cadence. Now it's just a really small conversation, as opposed to, whoa, this is a really big one. This is really tricky. And it's only a really big one because we never dealt with it at the beginning. Yeah. So we want to capture them as early as possible. And then when we do capture them, to me, there's two parts in it. And it really, you made the point earlier, this is about me. And so that conversation can be about me. And maybe it starts with, Jenny, how are you? We've said this so many times, only ask that question if you care. And there may be some answers in there. I may need some different support than if, you know what, I'm bored, I'm fed up, this is a thankless task, and I'm just doing this, where I used to do this, now I'm just doing this. Okay, that's a different conversation too. And so by starting with what's going on in my world and asking that question, we can begin to have the conversation that needs to happen. And when we have that conversation around an issue, and I think I've seen it flow by in the chat somewhere, the age old, and it's awful, is, okay, well, we'll just sandwich it. Jenny, you did really well here. This sucked. And I quite like what you're doing here. I promise you, the only thing that I will take away from that meeting is what sucked. So now we've wasted 2 opportunities to elevate somebody. Don't waste those opportunities. And then the other thing that we've got wrapped up, and this is because of just the way that performance conversations got branded. Well, I'll be constructive with my criticism. And you've heard me say that before too. Those 2 words don't belong in the same sentence. There's no need for criticism. There's no need for cruelty. There's no need for criticism. We just want to be constructive. And so now the conversation is easy. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what we agreed that we were going to look for. This is how we define success. We have a delta between the 2. What's your take on that? As in me, the person who's doing it. Now, where it gets tricky is if you've been promoted because you used to be good at my job, you totally believe you have the answer. And it's really, really hard to pause when you think that you have the answer. But remember, this is my job, my career, and my everyday work. And so in having those conversations, that's a really long answer for a short question. Have them early, keep them task focused, and remember it's a human on the other side of that conversation. Be in touch with that human.
Yeah, you touched on some really great points there. And I think one of them for me, because there's a question in the chat is, how do you prep for this? Or how do you prep for this? How do you revisit, if you find yourself revisiting the conversation, this same conversation? I think there's something about making sure where you can point to data around performance, keeping it objective versus subjective. When you have to go subjective, I think a phrase I've always heard that seems to work well to help set up the conversation is, the way that I see things is this, right? How are you seeing it, right? And I think that can help. It's a subtle phrase, perhaps, but I think it's always about trying to take the emotion out of that conversation as much as you can, right? Because let's face it, it's going to be emotional for the individual on the other end who you're perhaps suggesting isn't living up to expectations. And you can't, if it isn't emotional, that tells you something, perhaps, right? Tells you the level of care about the role, perhaps, right? But how do you help those conversations be as objective as possible, I guess? If that's the right question.
Yeah, I want to talk about emotion first, because the danger here, you're right, in that we want to tackle the task, the issue. So this isn't personal. But the minute that we go face to face, it's another phrase that drives me out the wall. Craig, this is not personal, or don't take this personally. Are you standing face to face? You can't get more personal than that. So what we want to do is,
with all due respect.
Oh, right? Don't even start me. But the encouragement is, take this professionally, not personally. We have to remember that we are humans in there, and that emotion is really important. But it's the management of the emotion, because if you show me no emotion, I don't know if you care. Hey, okay, I'm not going to show I'm frustrated. I'm not going to do any of that. No, I don't know. You're just talking numbers. You don't like the numbers, but I've got no connection to you if I don't know what it is. And so within that, and that being objective is, you put down the results if it's there, if that's where we're going in that conversation. And Jenny, I can see X, Y, and Z. And I think I've had this conversation with you before. and I'm frustrated that I can't support this performance. What's going on your side? Or what are you seeing or encountering that I don't? And the key when you ask that kind of question, stop talking. Because what we do when we're anxious, remember, these are difficult conversations, is we fill the space and we keep talking. And you ask me a question like that, where it's there and you care, and I'm picking up that care, I can't answer that question straight away. I have to digest that and think about it. You're talking 8-10 seconds and it feels like eternity, but don't fill the space. Give that person the respect of being able to think about it.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So are we suggesting that we just simply eliminate formal performance reviews?
So the danger is, and there's lots of companies that have done that, like there's plenty of information out there on this. And it seems to be the trend. My encouragement is, though, you might abandon the system, like we said at the beginning. It's probably costing your company millions of dollars and not achieving what you want it to achieve. But I think that we can't lose the performance conversation. We can lose the rubbish systems. We can lose the calibration nonsense, but we have to separate what we're talking about. And so can we just have a cadence of excellent performance conversations? Yes. And if we do that, and we're not having to rank people against each other, if I'm not in competition with you because it can only be 1-5, what happens at that point is we're still talking about performance all the time. We're still raising it, and we don't have to be in competition. And so when that happens, organizations can legitimately ask for high performing teams. Like, it is not fair to say to you, Craig, you need to have a high performing team here and you've got to achieve this. And your poor team are fighting against each other for that one number 5 or that one number 4. Why would I support a team member if that could make all the difference? So there's a lot of, yes, let's change the system, let's get rid of it. But that doesn't mean that we stop caring, talking, driving towards performance and accountability. And then people say, well, what do we do with the money that we would have given them? Okay, you still got the money. Give Craig a bucket of money and say, Craig, no, not for you. Say, Craig, say, like, you take care of this. How do you see this as fit? If we're going to do that, though, we have to educate our leaders on all the ramifications around that. That's another 100% different conversation again. So yes, and is the answer to that.
Yeah. So let's kind of take this maybe perhaps one step further. Maybe you've kind of gone there, but if you are somebody listening to this conversation who is in a system where you've eliminated performance reviews, I think we've kind of established, ideally you're having regular, frequent check-ins, and that environment of regular feedback, and just there's going to be no surprises, right? As you progress through the year. If you are somebody listening to this conversation who doesn't have a choice, right? You have to go through this every year. Because of whatever it might be, that's just the way your company is, or under collective agreements, perhaps there's ratings required, etc. That doesn't stop you from still having regular feedback conversations. But how do you marry the two? What's your advice on how do you bring this together if you have to still be in a system where I am required to still provide somebody with a number at the end of the year, plus this ideal of getting into regular feedback, ongoing conversations?
I think that I think it's almost as simple as we've talked about. If you're the leader and you have that system in place, that's your job. You have to take care of that system, but you still have a team of humans. And so imagine what would happen if you could increase that cadence, increase that frequency, And at this point, I would encourage you to carry the celebrations into the conversation, so that by the time you get to the conversation, really what's on our pieces of paper that we are accountable to put into the system is, no surprise, well tracked between the two of us, open part of the conversation. And within there, to every extent that is possible, can you support, and I don't know what the right word is, but what we're looking for is the person doing the right tasks that engage them? And we're back to, what do your people love to do? Have you got them in the right place? Are they doing the right tasks? Are you celebrating that? Just because your system says twice a year doesn't mean the conversation has to be twice a year. And you can make those performance reviews really easy because you've done all the work all the way through the year. Don't just go into the system twice a year because the company says go into the system twice a year. Maybe you can bring the system alive. Like, maybe there's good in it.
Yeah.
And definitely involve the human on the other side, because that's secretary. They vote for you with their life when they come to work with you.
Yeah. There is so much to still unpack in this entire conversation. And I think we can definitely revisit in the future, but we're coming up on our time.
Oh.
And so I think the thing I would like to suggest to folks is that be intentional about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you currently have existing one-on-ones on your calendar without some intentionality behind it, right? It's just employee wanders into your office, sit down, and you pick up and start the conversation. Maybe think about, how do you reframe it? How do you walk away from this conversation and perhaps thinking about, how do I make these more intentional? How do I make them more focused so they don't go down the rabbit holes of there's issue A, there's fire B, this isn't working, right? You're still going to have those conversations. But I think as a leader, it's important that you make sure you carve out that time for intentional focus on performance, coaching, etc. So really try and think about that, because it is so simple. I think for me, that's probably one of the things that gets in the way the most. It is so easy to let your one-on-one turn into the, here's all the monkeys on my back, I'm trying to pass them off and take care of it all. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Over to you to wrap us up for the day, Jenny.
All right, so let's go there, if we can get there quickly.
You always can. And we will try very hard to get to the questions that we missed in the follow-up material.
Maybe we just lost the...
Well, we've hit the end of the show. So everybody can click to exit.
This is not a problem.
Yeah.
We got this, the black slide. So we always finish with, what's our one big idea? 2 things that we would hope that you can take away and put into practice somewhat immediately. And then 3 questions. So the big idea, when I get the opportunity, we won't have performance reviews anymore. We'll have performance previews. I really, really like that reframe on it. And a performance preview says, what is it that you want to do? And how can I help you get there? And if you're a big fan of disrupting, okay, well, what are you going to disrupt in the next month or in the next 3 months? How am I going to help you there? And in that conversation, we can make sure that it fits into alignment. But previewing is far more exciting than reviewing. So if we have that cadence of conversation, we will always be able to preview. 2 things that you can take away with you. And when you get your notes at the end of this, you will get access to the slides that have this on. But the first one is, this is about individual development, really. And if we're going to enter the conversation of individual development, you have to know your people, which means talking with your people, not to your people. It's a distinct difference. Do you know their strengths? Do you know what brings them joy? Do you know what they love to do? All within a work frame. Big, big conversations, but they get missed. To your point, we're busy. So that would be a great check-in conversation. What do you love about your job? Find out. What are their strengths? Because what they see as their strengths probably isn't what you see as their strengths. We don't have to get rid of either one. Let's marry the 2 together and make the most of it. And then our second takeaway slide was all about this cadence of communication. So recapping actually what we talked about, Craig, was 2 people are in the conversation. So watch your voice share. Remember, conversations, especially within performance, we have to build trust. You are looking for competence and reliability. Your people are looking for sincerity and care. All 4 of those build trust all of the time. And the only, and I think I said this already, the only failure is to not have the conversation at all. So one way or another, have the conversation. And it blew it. I put 4 questions, as always. I think the slide now says 3+ questions. So the questions you might take away and noodle from here are, what are your strengths and how are you using them? What brings you joy at work? If you're going to ask other people these questions, you need your own answers too. What is your current check-in frequency? And if your immediate answer is, I have too many people and I don't have enough time, there's the first work, because leading is a currency of check-ins, like it's a frequency and a cadence. And then what are your conditions for performance? We touched on the 6 that research have given us. Doesn't mean that they have to be your conditions. And that was it, verbally.
Excellent. Well, one of the things that brings me joy at work, Jenny, are these conversations. And as always, thank you so much for everything that you brought to it. Folks, we love chatting with you. Jenny, I had to chuckle. I used to have a manager years ago who would sign off his voicemails with "talk at you later." And it is so good to talk with you all. And we are back on November 17th. The link is in the notes. You can find it on our LinkedIn page. And have yourselves a fantastic weekend, whether you're going to the Christmas markets or not. And we will talk to everybody soon. Take care.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig.